I really do believe this is an industry that you have to be self-motivated to survive it. You can always just kind of skate by. There are people who do skate by, but there's always going to be a point where you're going to run into a wall a little bit because there's always someone new. And the industry loves new. And they're always going to find the new person. So how do you continue to, keep that forward momentum? And the propulsion of your career is all up to you. It's not your agent. It's not your agency. It's not studios or networks. It's like, how can I keep this thing going?
I'm Charla Lariston. I've been a TV writer for almost a decade, but it wasn't that long ago that quitting my day job and moving to Hollywood was nothing but a pipe dream. After lots of failures, many mistakes, and many lessons learned, I've now written for 7 TV shows, 2 features, and sold 3 TV pilots. I've done all this through imposter syndrome, burnout, and with zero roadmap. On the Working Writer podcast, I pull back the curtain on breaking in and teach screenwriters and creatives how to thrive both personally and professionally. Without further ado, let's get to work. Welcome to another episode of the Working Writer podcast. Thank you so much for joining me once again. As usual, I'm so excited to introduce the guest for today's interview, Rochée Jeffrey. Rochée is a TV writer and stand-up comedian who's written for shows like SMILF and Grownish, and she also directed and executive produced a narrative podcast for Audible called Yes, We Cannabis. In this episode of the podcast, Rochée and I kind of get into a crash course on the business of Hollywood. I hope you enjoy it, and I hope you get a lot out of this episode. Without any further ado, here's my episode with Rochée Jeffrey. Rochée Jeffrey!
Yes.
Welcome to the show. I'm so excited to have you. You're an original homie, I like to call you. You're one of the homies. I usually start with where somebody's from, but I kind of want to start on a different tone with you because you're Jamaican, and I know that. And I know you went to an HBCU.
Yes.
And I actually feel like there's actually a lot more interesting things that I think are relatable about you that I kind of want to jump into. And it's that you have made the move into stand-up this year. And as primarily a writer-director, I found it really interesting to kind of like be a part of the process and kind of like, or just be there while you were making this transition into performing live stand-up. And I kind of wanted you to talk about like what made you go in that direction and what has the experience been like for you?
Yeah, I think that if I'm being completely honest, I got really comfortable with my career and I got to a place where I wasn't necessarily doing everything I could do to get myself out there. And I think that's easy to do in this business. And so stand-up has always been there in the back of my head. And it's something I tried like 10 years ago and I never had a bad experience. I just wasn't ready to really put myself out there. And I think I'm in an era of putting myself out there more. And the hope for me is by doing stand-up, you could see my unfiltered voice. Because when we're writing on shows, oftentimes, right, 90% of the time, our voice is being filtered through the showrunner, the creator's voice. And this is my opportunity to stand up and literally hear what I have to say unfiltered. And it's been such a great exercise. And it's also helped me, I think, become a better writer. And spiritually, I think stand-up is interesting because it was always scared me because I didn't want to put myself out there. But it's also just made me feel more confident. And so it's been a really good experience, I think.
All right. You said something super interesting, which I think is at the heart of this, which is you said that you were afraid to put yourself out there, which is something that I've struggled with, even though I've performed stand-up comedy and have done live improv and things like that. But even as a writer in the writer's room, I struggle to kind of put myself out there still in some ways by, pitching an idea that I think is not perfect, or putting out an idea into the world, maybe on YouTube, that I think is not like, I don't know how people are going to receive it. Maybe I think it's great. But in general, we all struggle with being seen and putting ourselves out there. I kind of want to delve into it a little bit and just ask, what do you think you were getting out of hiding? And what have you learned from putting yourself out there?
Whew. I think hiding for me was a form of protection, and it was in service to my ego, which is funny because when you think about ego, you think people are kind of out there, ostentatious, big, bad, and bold. But I also think there's a way that you can kind of give into your ego that is the opposite of that, which is like, oh, I'm going to hide myself so that I don't end up being judged, or people don't see me in a certain light, right? And that can also be really bad as well. It's not necessary for you to be bombastic and out there and showing off for you to also be ruled by your ego. And I think that's what it was for me, as I was being ruled by my ego. I didn't want to be judged. And I do think that the benefit now of showing a little bit more of who I am is that it does, I think, for writers, especially in comedy, your voice is everything. That's your currency. And it's allowed for people to see like, oh, this is how I see the world. This is my comedic voice. This is my comedic worldview in a way that you wouldn't be able to see otherwise. And I think that's empowering for me, because the negative side of the business, right, is that sometimes your voice is questioned, your voice is undermined. And so I had to go through this process of finding my voice again. And by doing this, it's really allowed me to do that, for sure.
That's awesome. You also did another kind of transition thing where, you directed a narrative podcast, which was outside of your kind of comfort zone.
Yeah.
What made you decide to take on that challenge, like of directing something that you hadn't directed before?
I think that, the goal for me is always to create my own content that, could reach the masses, to ultimately be a showrunner. And to get there, you need practice. Hopefully, ideally, you don't want to have the opportunity and you've never really done anything on that scale. This allowed me that. On a smaller scale, right? Our budget is the same as what a $20 million show was, but it was a big enough budget that we could get some stars. We had a stacked cast and a lot of support from Audible and Broadway Video. And that was really just like invaluable experience to be able to direct these incredible actors, to write all of the episodes, co-write them with my co-creator, and to essentially run the rooms that we had to break the story and to punch up the scripts. So to take something from conception to post-production as well and go through the post process, I learned so much doing post. And these were all things that I would not have been able to necessarily do in the TV world, but I could do in this world, which was comparable in a lot of ways, and skills that are transferable for sure. So to me, it was an opportunity to also be where stories are being told. One of my things I've told my team is that I want to tell stories wherever stories are being told. So I'm very open to a play, to a one-woman show, a now stand-up. Wherever people are telling stories, I want to tell stories. And so this was an opportunity to tell stories in a new kind of emerging area, which is, narrative podcasts.
That's very cool. What was that cast was really stacked. It had Tanisha? What's her name?
Tashina Arnold.
It had Tashina Arnold. It had Alan Alda, right? It had kind of huge people.
Yeah. We had
What was
Sam
that like?
Richardson. Yeah, it was
Yeah.
amazing. I think for me, I had one of those moments like on my spiritual journey where I was like, at one point, I had an out of body experience because I was directing Method Man, and I think 12-year-old me was like, "What is happening?" But I think it was great because for the overwhelmingly everybody was so great and so wonderful, and just watching really phenomenal actors do their thing is just, you see why they're so great. So I learned a lot just by watching them, for sure.
What was the hardest part about doing that job?
Whew. I think the hardest part for me, um, the hardest part was writing those scripts. I had to co-write 10 scripts. And also, I will say, actually, truthfully, the hardest part wasn't the actual act of writing it. It was understanding the form, because you don't have the opportunity to have visuals. So how do you tell a compelling story without visuals? If anything, I grew as a writer afterwards because I was able to maximize story on the page in a way that I'd never been forced to before. So it allowed me to really go deeper with like, how do I make this interesting? How do I keep the momentum? And we can't see anything. So that challenge, I think, actually strengthened my skills as a writer, for sure.
Is there any way that you'd be able to like kind of describe like what narrative podcast writing is, or like how it's different from screenwriting?
Yes, I could speak to how Audible kind of likes it. So the way that Audible approaches it is they kind of like the seasons to be contained. So you're kind of telling a beginning, middle, and end story in a, episodic format. We were lucky enough to get 30-minute episodes. So we had 10 30-minute episodes. And your first episode is different than a traditional pilot in that this is a pilot where you can be a little bit more expositional. You can give more of the backstory in a way that you typically wouldn't want to do in a traditional television pilot. And so what we were able to do as well was like maximize the audio aspect of it, so that we could do a lot of like audio flashbacks to explain things that were going on in the moment. And our story wasn't, it was about three Black friends starting, co-creator who's a comedian who used to be a pharmacist, who started working in the cannabis industry to sustain himself. And so it wasn't your typical narrative podcast where there's like a murder investigation. So we created an investigation, actually. And that was how we kind of framed the episodes. Because you also want to find a framework that makes sense for the audio format. So that's why a lot of times it will be like an investigation, and so these are the tapes, or you'll find like a way into the story to frame it, so that it makes sense that you're listening to it.
All right. Is there anything that like, because you talked about how it's not visual, so you have to write in a sort of visual way. Like, how do you describe that? Like, how do you write in an even more visual way than you would write a script? Because even a script you have to write kind of visually.
Well, it's actually less visual and more sound. So we take the visual out of it, and we're looking for soundscape. We're looking for how do we build this out from an audio perspective. So a perfect example of this is there's an episode where they're at a cannabis convention, and to layer in the sound, we had like PAs, PA announcements, right, which we use for comedic beats. We had, music playing. We had people performing on stage. We had one of the booths at the convention was a VR experience. So then you go on the VR experience, and it took you on a tour through Silver Lake, right? So we found ways to really, how do we use sound to move the story forward and to create interesting experiences within the episode. Then we did one episode, which I pitched because I was like, I've never seen it or heard this before, which was like a podcast episode within the podcast. So Method Man played a podcast host, and these characters were on his podcast. So we used that as the framework for the episode. And then we built in like commercials within the podcast that we made like comedic. So we found ways to like, it's keeping it interesting, and within the confines of sound.
That's very dope. That's very cool. So one of the things that I find very amazing about you, Rochée, is that I think that you're like one of the most self-motivated writers that I've ever met. Like you're always working on a new project. You're always developing. You're like so dedicated and like persistent. I kind of want to know, like, have you always been this way? Was this something that you developed because of like the demands of the industry? Like, how did you get to this point in terms of your self-motivation?
You know, I have a chip on my shoulder, Charlotte. I think for me, it's like I have a learning disability, right? So I'll just be frank about
What is
that.
it?
I have ADD, and it's very,
Oh,
very severe. It's like bad,
I didn't
bad,
know
bad
that.
ADD. And like it was hard, like school was hard for me. Like I would always get good grades, and then I would have a semester when I had 4.0, and then the next semester would be a 2.0. It was hard for me to have like structure and be disciplined. But that chip on my shoulder, this desire to like prove myself, I think has translated to this business. And because I know it's so competitive, and it's so difficult, I've always tried to do the work to keep moving. And it's one of those things where I really do believe this is an industry that you have to be self-motivated to survive it. You can always just kind of skate by. There are people who do skate by, but there's always going to be a point where you're going to run into a wall a little bit, because there's always someone new, and the industry loves new, and they're
Yeah.
always going to find the new person. So how do you continue to, keep that forward momentum, and the propulsion of your career is all up to you. It's not your agent. It's not your agency. It's not studios or networks. It's like, how can I keep this thing going? How can I lubricate the parts that need to be lubricated? Like that's what it is. You can't sit around and wait. And if you do, you'll end up where I kind of end up a couple of years ago, where I turned around and was like, oh, nothing's really happening.
Yeah.
What's going on? And nothing's really happening because I got really comfortable.
Right. Nothing's happening because you're not putting out work, which is building momentum, which is giving your agents and managers something to push you with,
to talk about,
and to talk about, to send out on your behalf and things like that.
Yeah.
But there's a difference between being self-motivated and actually being able to execute. You know what I mean? And I feel like, especially for somebody with ADD, which I don't know if I have, but I'm starting to wonder if that's the case. Execution can be impossible. You know what I mean? It can be like, you can have all the ideas in the world, but actually getting it to a point where you're putting something out there is a whole nother story. So I'm wondering, like, how are you step by step getting things out the door?
Well, I'll say this. It starts, number one, with your environment. So I think, like, I have a home office that I've designed to be stimulating and to have all of the things that I need to be able to function and to get work done. And I have all sorts of whiteboards, and today my partner was like, you have so many surfaces to write on in this office. But like having a place to make lists, having your system down, I call it my system of success. And oftentimes that system of success,
I love
there's
that
a lot
so
of,
much.
yes,
that's so cute.
It's a system of success, because, and sometimes that success involves a lot of failure. There are days like today, before this, I went to the gym. I said I was going to do all sorts of stuff. I didn't do a gosh darn thing. So, except for this, and I did a little research for this interview I have coming up. But other than that, like, I wasn't as productive. But what I've done is, like, for instance, I have like on my desk, I have this little dry erase thing where I'll put down, like, okay, in bold letters, this is what you're doing, sis. This is what we're trying to do today. And that's the goal, right? Like, I don't know if it's going to get done, but I'm looking at it right in front of me, and that gives me a little bit of something to like, a little motivation. Another thing that I found that really works for me too is deadlines. And so sometimes you have to just make them up. So what I'll do is if I'm working on a project with a collaborator or something, whether it's a producer or whatever, I'm co-writing something, I'll be like, look, can we set a deadline for January 31st? So that way I have something real, because with ADD, there is a real problem with, we have this phenomenon where we only get things done when there's literally a gun to our head. And sometimes that works for us. And then academically, and in school and stuff, sometimes that would work. Like if I had a test, I would cram the night before or write the paper, and that the adrenaline would run. But for writing, you've got to create those deadlines. So I think deadlines really, really help. And writers groups, things like that, I think allow for you to have these built-in deadlines. Okay, we're meeting on Sunday. I have to turn this in on Friday. Last Friday, I had to turn in like the first 2 acts of a feature because I was meeting with people on Sunday. So things like that, you have to kind of build in to be able to get things done. That's really what it comes down to. Or even using timers. Sometimes I'll just set a timer for an hour and I'm like, I gotta get this done. Whatever I get done in this hour is what I got done for the day,
I love it. So it sounds like it's just, I mean, it's a lot of things. But it more than anything, it's being intentional about. I gotta get something done today. Yeah, and
it's also trying different things and seeing what works. I'm also big on meeting up with a friend at a coffee shop. That also helps me get stuff done. Everybody's got their thing, and you kind of know the things that get you motivated, and so it's figuring out ways to incorporate more of that in your everyday life.
I have to have a deadline. I'm one of those as well. I must have a deadline. And it can't be like a joke one either. It has to be for real. Like that figurative gun to your head is what I need. Like I need actual, like somebody to be disappointed. Like somebody's going to be mad if I don't, or a check's not coming. You know what I mean? Like it needs to be serious, to get me to do my best work. You mentioned that you're getting ready for an interview. That's a staff job interview.
Mm-hmm.
How do you prepare for interviews?
Well, so here's what I've realized. As you kind of move up, the interviews are they're different. And so now I'm interviewing for like number 2, number 3 roles. So I go really hard in the paint. So I'll look up, first watch as many episodes as I can. If it's a show that's been on for many seasons, I'll watch the last season to see where things are. I'll read articles and reviews about the show because I like to see how people think about the show and what themes and things I may not have picked up on that they are recognizing. I look up the showrunner and I'll look up articles and podcast interviews. So I'll listen to their podcast because I like to hear like, okay, what's their POV on writing? What's their POV on running a room? If I'll look on YouTube, if it's a bigger showrunner, like they have some interviews and panels and things like that. So I do a deep dive, and then I tried my best to research like shows that they may have mentioned that they're into. Like for this show that I'm interviewing for, they mentioned a few shows that they're influenced by. So I want to do some research on that. And then the subject matter. So if the show is about New York in the 1950s, I want to make sure I'm reading up on New York in the 1950s with the context that I need to in order to be prepared. So I try to be as prepared as possible going into it. It's oftentimes too at this level, it's actually more of a vibe check too. They want to know like, who are you? Are you cool? Are you going to be somebody I could trust to get things across the finish line? So I want to know the showrunner really well. That's like really important to know like what they're about, what they're vibing with, and organically be able to be like, this is something that we have in common.
Yeah. What do you do to get your mentals ready? Is the deep research? Because I feel like for some people, if they don't have that amount of research, then they're not calm and cool and collected during the interview. But for me, it's both. It's like both that I had to do the research, that I had to watch the show, that I had to, like find whatever out I could find out about the showrunner and what their POV is. But I also have to have a really good night's sleep or else like I'm going to be cranky. I can't be
Yeah.
hungry or I'm going to be hangry. Like a lot
Yeah.
of things have to be in place for me.
Yeah, I personally think for me with an interview, I try my best to not do anything before. So it's like I'm gonna go to the gym and get mentally prepared for it, come back, do a little some more research, and then get ready and go. And then that's it. I don't want to do anything before this interview because I want to keep
Yep.
my energy clear. I also think it's important to dress well. Like you don't have to dress up,
You have
but
to.
bring
Yeah.
bring an outfit. I also think it's great to have an outfit with perspective.
What does
I
that mean?
like I can just wear, because there's wearing clothes and then there's wearing an outfit that is a subject of conversation or that shows your point of view and how you see the world, right? So I
Okay.
always try to be very stylish when I have like big meetings because I want to be remembered and that also makes me more confident. So when I go in, I know I have a fit. I know it's going to be memorable and I'm going to feel good like going in. And this is me. Like you're going to get a point. You're going to get a sense of like, okay, this is somebody who's colorful. This is somebody, whatever your thing is. I do think that that does. And even if your like thing is, I wear great sweats, you know what I mean? Like,
Right.
I think whatever that thing is, like bring that to the interview because this is an in-person interview. So I want to look like myself, the best version of
Oh
myself.
wow, an in-person interview. Those are
Yeah.
old school.
Before
Oh my
times.
god. Those are
Before
from the
times.
before times. But you're right that TV writing, being a TV writer, I feel like, or at least being a creative in the TV industry is the one industry where you can wear sweats and that is actually like a fashion statement. Like you really can wear almost whatever you want within within reason.
Agreed.
So I do try to dress my best, of course, for an
Yeah,
interview. You wouldn't want to go in looking crusty.
exactly.
Let's take a break here, and when we come back, I got some more questions for you. And we're back. Um, so I had this. I was watching this YouTube video. That was a response to a bunch of YouTubers quitting. I'm like really into YouTube. I watch a lot of YouTube and there's a bunch of YouTubers that are quitting. And there's been a bunch of people who have been doing like response videos to those as a response to those YouTubers quitting or taking like extended breaks or whatever. And there was this one video I watched where this lady talks about how the internet has just completely changed, how this is a really long preamble to the question, but it's coming, I promise. It's just background info.
Yeah.
And her video was about how the internet is very different than it was even a few years ago or like before social media started. And everything kind of sucks now. That it's really hard to make an impression on the internet. And I think it's the same for TV, frankly. I think we're in that void. We're in that period of time where everything feels like it's just being thrown into a void. It's really like things that are big, that would have been big 5 years ago, like are not, they could have the same viewership and it's not big now or something like that. Everything just feels very fleeting. It feels very hard to make an impact or make a statement. And I've been frankly feeling very like, as an artist, as a creative, as somebody who makes things or wants to make things, I've struggled with that a bit because I 100% feel like that is true. And now the algorithm is serving me all these videos that are similar. So I'm just like, do I think this is true? Or am I just being like, influenced? But I actually do think that I've felt this way at certain times. I continue to do things because I feel like I must. I feel like I just do it, It feels very instinctual to me. But I just wanted to get your vibes on that because as somebody who must tell stories, which is how I think of you, do you agree? Do you feel this kind of shift in the world in media? How do you feel?
I mean, I think we've absolutely reached our saturation point, right? There are so many shows that debut and we don't talk about it after the first day that it's released and it's never seen again. I think it is tough to stand out. I think it's also it's interesting though. There's so many shows, but there are not that many shows about marginalized folks, right? So in a lot of ways, I think there's still, that's something that has to be figured out, right? Like, why do we have so many shows, but there's still so few shows in terms of proportion that speak to these groups of people? And so I think with that said, there's a real opportunity to speak to these groups of people outside of the traditional paradigms. I think what's happened is, like, there's so much focus and emphasis on platforms and networks and studios, the traditional model. I think that people are interested in watching, like, people who are not underrepresented. If you present the material to them and you find a way to get to them, they're going to eat it up. There's a show that was on YouTube. I forgot what it was, but it's like this show that's super hood, wasn't shot well, had like millions of views on YouTube. I forgot the name of it, but it was huge. And it actually ended up, I think Stars picked it up 5 years ago. But the point is, it was speaking to an underserved community and people were eating it up. So do I think that model is shifted? Of course. Like, Issa Rae in part was able to stand out with a web series because she was one of the first to really have that exposure. Now there's a million web series and no one is really making web series like that anymore, right?
Yeah.
But I do think that there are models that have yet to be discovered or that are under, appreciated that will allow for folks to reach those communities. And I personally think that it will take some creativity, but I still think there's room for it. And for me, my thing is, yes, I'm going to go down the traditional path, of course. Like, yes, I want to, make money, this studio money, but I'm also interested in entrepreneurship and finding ways to get these stories out there, because my experience with stand-up has also really illuminated this for me. The gatekeepers in this business do not necessarily reflect the taste of the audience. And what they're interested in making is not necessarily what the industry or what the audience wants. So if you can build an audience outside of the traditional paradigm, that's how you get power in this business. And if you look at some of the marginalized folks like that have become super powerful, they actually operated outside of the industry. Will Packer.
What's an
Tyler
example?
Perry.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Will Packer, Tyler Perry. Will Packer will tell you too. He says it all the time. He's like, go find your audience. He produced movies independently in Florida. He was at FAMU. So, he built his network, sort of making stuff independently, and the industry found him. Tyler Perry, same thing, right? Like a lot of Ava DuVernay, a lot of people, Black folks who are at the height of the highest heights of the business are people who did it outside of the business. So I think there's something to be said about that. And it's not a coinky dink that's the case. So find your audience. And if that means you take your stuff on tour, you know what I mean? And you start doing small theaters throughout the South or New York or major cities with whatever, there's a way to get it out there and to reach people.
I love that. When you started talking about, when you said Black folk, you sounded almost like civil rights leader.
Yes.
Rochée gets very crunk when she starts talking about building your own empire, essentially.
I'm telling you.
Absolutely. So one of the things I love about you is that you also always talk about the business side of writing. You know what I mean? Because I feel like there's so little guidance about the actual business side. And I also feel like there's a lot of resistance amongst writers specifically to think of themselves as business people
Yes.
when even though they're wanting to enter a business.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that? And how have you made yourself, I guess, more amenable to the business side of the writing career?
I think that you have every right to not care about the business, but you're going to have a limited career. And that's okay.
Ooh.
When I say, and I'm not saying that in a bad way. I say limited in the sense that, like, you'll always be working for somebody else or working within the system. And
wait, what do you think when I say business? What are you saying? Are you saying like literally build your own business essentially?
No, I think in terms of the context of the question, it operates on two levels. I think there's a sort of like entrepreneurship like lane, but there's also like the business of the business. And I do believe that if you're not kind of aware of how the business operates, you'll always be kind of at the behest of other folks within the business, and you won't be able to like move in a certain way, right? You'll always be waiting for somebody to hire you, which is fine. Like, that is absolutely a legitimate path. And everybody is not trying to be a boss, and everybody's not trying to, just like there's, you know, all this pushback in the business world about like, you should be an entrepreneur. Everybody doesn't need to be an entrepreneur. Some people want to collect their check and keep it moving. But I do think,
God bless you too, you know?
Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with that. I do think that if you want to have more power, if you want to have more leverage, if you want to either operate at the highest levels within this paradigm that exists or create your own, you have to understand the business is an entertainment business. And I do think that it's something that a lot of writers don't think about. A lot of writers, I meet way too many writers, unfortunately, who I feel are disempowered, who are always like waiting for something to happen for them. And it's because they don't understand the business. And they often are like waiting for their agent to do something. And I'm like, girl, I actually think it's just as important to listen to podcasts like this as it is to listen to entrepreneurship podcasts, because there are certain things that you can learn from those spaces, and learning from podcasts about the actual business of the business than just the creative stuff and even just the things in our lane, right? You have to be aware. I read the trades all the time. My friends circulate trade articles all the time because it's good to know, oh, yes, the head of Netflix film left. What does that mean for Netflix, and what does that mean for film? Oh, there's an article that movies aren't getting made at the $20 million mark. What does that mean for me? If you don't know what's happening, then how do you make moves? How do you adjust? How do you create material that speaks to where the business is going? And now I just read an article, agent at WME, he said that he believes that comedy is going to have a resurgence because you can make comedy for a price, right? And also he was saying that people are going to be independently making comedy. And then that's going to be the model. So that's something we should know, right? Like, if you're working in the comedy space, hey, which is perfect for me because my plan has been this year to make an independent pilot. So I do think that it's critical to really understand how the business is moving and to operate as a business person simultaneously as you operate as an artist, because we have loan outs for a reason. Once we get to a certain level, you're president and CEO of Charla's career, you know?
Right.
And that's just that. That's the only way you can make it happen, is if you think of it like that.
I agree. I think that like I feel like that's the difference between being somebody who writes as a hobby and somebody who writes professionally, or like writes to sell or writes to work on TV shows, is being aware of what's going on, and absolutely you can create things and write things for your own satisfaction, for your own creative expression. But at the same time, if you're creating, for instance, like an epic television show, a drama or whatever, and let's say, which is not what I think is happening, but let's say the industry is really not buying that right now, and putting it out there and then being surprised when that thing doesn't sell. I feel like that was like a really, really bad example. but the my point, the point I'm trying to make is creating with the understanding of what's out there, and what is competitive in that, to a certain extent. I feel like that was the worst explanation possible. I kind of actually wanted you to, if you can explain in layman terms, because you said if you don't quote unquote understand the business, then it's going to be hard for you to navigate. Can you, in layman's terms, explain what is this business that people talk about all the time? What is the business?
I mean, I think there's just, like, if we're talking about it from the TV writer's perspective, right? The TV writer's perspective, there are different lanes that exist and they all operate within this realm, right? You have your studios, your networks, you have your agents, and agencies and management companies, you have production companies, right? And this creates, and the artists, and this creates this really kind of vibrant ecosystem of creativity within this world. But they all play different roles. And so it's understanding the roles that everyone plays, the trends, right? Like, what are the trends in all of these different lanes? How are things getting across the finish line? And understanding the money of the business as well, which is a whole other thing, right? And so I do think that when I think of the business, I'm thinking about all of these kind of moving parts that come together to create this kind of nebulous idea of the entertainment business that is also kind of real in a lot of ways. But me as a writer, what I need to understand, I think, in order to thrive is, okay, the role that my agents and managers play in my career and outward facing, like, how are they engaging with the rest of the business? I need to understand what producers bring to the table and how, for instance, with certain projects, I need certain producers on them. Certain projects, it may make more sense to have a producer who is also an actor. So I can attach that actor and get that production company on board. And that actor has heat, that production company has heat. So understanding that. And then the same thing goes for studios and networks, right? For instance, one of the things we have to remember as writers is the studio model is shifting and is dying, right? A lot of times, a lot of these platforms, for instance, aren't going to want to work with studios anymore in the near future, because it comes at a premium. It comes at an extra cost to have to license these shows, and they're trying to build up their own library. So that's something we should be aware of as we're thinking about who we collaborate with, because in the 2, 3, 4 years, these studios may not exist because they're making less sales because these platforms want to have their own library, right? That's business stuff. You know what I mean?
Could you give an example of what you just said in like a very like layman terms, basic? Like, can you use an example of a studio and an example of a network?
Yes.
Or an
yes.
example of a platform that might not want to, yeah.
Okay, so for instance, let's say Sony. Sony is a studio. And the way that studios work, right, is a studio is essentially making the show that you've sold. They're going to make the show. They're putting up the cost, but they're getting paid a fee to make this show. And they still have ownership over the show. And the network has some ownership over it, but they're kind of paying this licensing fee to Sony for them to have it on their network, right? Now, if I'm a network being, say, ABC, or like a platform like Netflix, right? What's happened is that a Netflix and Apple, for example, they are companies that do not have a big library of material like ABC does, because it's part of the Disney and Fox family. So they have a huge library of things that they own. Apple, Netflix, they don't. And so what they were doing, Netflix for a long time, was essentially licensing shows that were made by these studios. And they started to realize, well, this is extra expensive because you have to pay on top, you have to pay these licensing fees, and then you don't actually own this at the end of it, right? So now there's a move towards these buyers, these platforms, these networks owning their material so that they can come back. They like, okay, this show is Stranger Things. It's a great hit. Now, 20 years from now, they can go back and they can make Stranger Things again and not have to pay extra fees because it's a part of their library, right?
So one example is, for instance, isn't Insecure about to be on Netflix?
Yes.
So Insecure is an HBO show. And so they had to license it from what? Warner? Who owns HBO?
Warner
I don't
Brothers.
even know.
Yeah.
Yeah, Warner Brothers. So that means Netflix, the platform, had to license that show from Warner Brothers to be able to play it on Netflix. But Netflix doesn't own it. Netflix can't remake it. Like Warner Brothers, HBO, whoever owns it forever, and they'll continue to make money from Insecure for as long as they own it. So 100%. It's just become too expensive for these platforms to continue to license.
To license everything. Yeah. It makes more sense for them now to start to invest in their own stuff.
Yeah. Right. Thanks for that crash course in the business of Hollywood. Like my mind is going so many places because now I want to really ask you about producing your own pilot, because you said that you might do that. A full length pilot or like a pilot presentation? Like,
it depends on how much money I'm able to raise. The ideal would be to just do the pilot. Shoot, why not? But I'm also very happy with doing like a 15-minute, 10-minute pilot presentation.
Okay. What is this idea that there's going to be more independent comedy pilots made? Like, what is that coming from?
I'll send you this article afterwards.
Send it to me.
Yeah. He was just saying that what's happening is, you can make a decent comedy pilot for a fraction of what it would cost to make a drama pilot. And so, for instance, the Duplass brothers funded an entire series that they were able to set up.
Which series was it?
I don't remember the name.
Was it that anthology series on HBO?
I don't know if it's come out yet, but there was just an article about how they funded an independent series. And they've always been, they operate independently.
They're very independent.
Very independent. But what people are discovering is like, it's a lot easier for me to go take $10 million and make like a 10-episode show. And then Netflix, all they have to do is spend $15 million and they got it. They didn't have to do a writer's room. They didn't have to do any of that. And they can still actually own the show. They can buy the show outright, right? So there is something to be said about that. And what it does is it eliminates a lot of like the gatekeeping that you have to go through and the hurdles you have to jump through. Now you have an idea. You have a financier. Go shoot the whole thing. And then you hope that it's good. And now you can go out and sell it. And in a lot of ways, it makes it easier for these platforms and these networks because they don't have to go through the whole drama of trying to develop it. You made it and it works and it's good. This might work for us. Let's try it. So I do think that is a viable thing that's going to be happening.
One finance a pilot independently.
Well, here's the thing that I've really been focused on. We talked about this last time. Like, I'm all about finding the money. The one thing that I realize is there's a lot of money out here, and there's different kinds of money, right? There's free money, meaning that there are people out here who are billionaires who are like, hey, I'll fund this, and I don't care if I get it back. It's $5 billion. Then there's money like Goldman Sachs money, where there's a black company that got a huge funding from Goldman Sachs, right? Now, that company, that's not free money. Goldman Sachs is expecting to get their money back for these TV shows, movies, whatever, right? Then there's free money. The people who just are like, whatever, I got money, here's $100,000, go make something. My goal is to find the free money. People who are...
Where does one find the free money?
Well, I mean,
where's that?
There are a lot of financiers circulating around the industry, right? Like, there's a lot. And that's kind of a good starting point. It's also getting to know rich people, getting to know people who could cut a check. That is Um, that's a huge part of it. Fundraising is a huge part of what I'm talking about when it comes to like independence and entrepreneurship. These people, like Macro, started because Charles King had connections to people who were billionaires, and he was able to raise that money. So, how do you build that? Well, it's like becoming the board member of such and such organization. It's going to charity and fundraisers where you can meet people who have money. It's asking around, right? I raised $70,000 last summer because I reached out to the richest people I knew, people I knew who had money, and I was like, hey, and they introduced me to other people who had money.
Mm-hmm.
Like one introduction led to another introduction. And I got $15,000 from a lady I'd never met before within 5 minutes.
That's crazy. That's crazy. What was your pitch? Like, how did you do this?
Well, I put together a deck for my short film, and I kind of, couched it in, hey, look, it was set up fiscally through Film Independence, so it was a write-off.
Okay.
And I created a deck, and I was like, this is what I want. This is how you can come in and you could be helpful. And this is the kind of money that people could give away if you're wealthy, where you're not going to lose sleep over it. And I used it as a way to kind of gauge and test this experiment. Like, I sent 6 emails and I raised $70K. That's
insane.
It's not, look, it comes from a place of privilege in the sense that I knew certain people that I could ask. Everybody doesn't know someone that they could ask.
Right.
But more people do than they actually, like when I thought of my immediate friends know I had $70,000. But when I thought of people I had worked with or knew, indirectly, that's how I was able to come up with the money.
But you also had like the legitimacy of being a part of something like Film Independent.
I did. Previously, yeah, I was a fellow. I think you brought up something really critical. Part of the reason why people wanted to invest in the project is they were investing in me.
Right.
And the reason why they felt like they were investing in me is that I've done a pretty decent job of establishing through social media, honestly, who I am. And through my accomplishments in my biography, absolutely, they were like, okay, we can support you. But part of the reason why they felt that way is because I promoted myself online. You've seen my posts. You see I was in Deadline. You see whatever it is that they saw made them feel like this was a legitimate investment in my career. And that's how people raise money, honestly.
Yeah.
Is people go,
so you have a resume.
Yeah.
You have a resume. So it's not like you were asking for money without having any kind of credentials. But at the same time, not all of us needs a full $70,000. But I'm just like, what do you think about someone who has zero credentials asking for money? Do you think that's something that somebody should do?
100%. Because I think it's all a practice. And you can couch it in different ways. Here's what I also suggest. It's never just about asking money. My project was a silly horror comedy, but it was about a larger issue in our society. If you can find a way to couch whatever you're doing within that framework where it's like, hey, this is about something bigger. This is an issue that we should be addressing. People can get on board. And also, my first GoFundMe, I had less of a resume, right? My GoFundMe, I did a Seed to Spark. You have to start somewhere. And I think that it's important to learn how to put yourself out there. And yeah, I wouldn't start with a $70,000 goal. I'd start with a $20,000 goal, a $50,000 goal, whatever it is. But we all have to start somewhere.
What is your plan to raise money? Even if you don't have like a strong plan yet, like what's your general plan to raise money for your independent pilot?
Well, I have identified some independent like financiers who I think would be interesting to partner with, who have expressed interest in other projects. And then I've also told my team that, look, one of the things I want to do, I do, at a top of the year meeting where I kind of go through a PowerPoint presentation of what I'm trying to do. One of the things I said is like, I want to meet more financiers and I want to meet more production companies and studios who have development money. Specifically, I want to spend time with those folks because like a Jax Media, for instance, is a perfect example. They're a production company that also produces pilots, and they've also independently financed films. So those are the companies I want to know more of. I want to build relationships with financiers, because a lot of the times when you're working in this business, you don't really get to meet financiers like that until you actually start to do features, and you have to have the right, agent who knows this person, or the right producer. So one of the things that I want to work on in the next year is to really get to know more financiers. Because then forget, who cares about these production companies? That's great. But like, if I could get you to give me $1 million, $5 million, and I know 2 financiers, one who has direct access to $1 billion, and another one who manages the company for somebody who's a billionaire, right? So like, to me, it's like, those are the relationships. When you're in the business, you can find your way to those financiers. Once you have agents, you can ask them to help you get there.
But as somebody who, like, I feel like somebody like me who I'm just starting to like get to the point where I'm like, oh, I could raise money, or like, oh, like somebody might give me money. Like, I don't know. Like, I feel like it's having to have like a sort of a mindset shift about asking for money, like, did you have to have that? And could you help me out with how do you ask for money?
Let me tell you. So this was my process last year. I started this. I said, Rochée, you have to make this film. You're on strike and you're broke. How are you going to make this happen, right? So I said, I can't do a campaign because no. So I have to go beyond myself and realize that people do want to support me. They do care about what I'm trying to do. And I emailed a guy I know who I had worked with before, who's very wealthy, who did not answer my email, right? So here's the thing. You're going to be turned down. There are people going to ignore you or never want to speak to you again, right? Those are people who who cares? Because those aren't people who are invested in you anyway. But there are going to be people in your circle, in your extended circle, who see your value, see the value of your project, and want to invest. And it's worthwhile because, again, you'll get to make this thing. I didn't have to spend a single dollar of my own, which I didn't have. And you will learn, it will be so expansive for you. Because once you do it, people raise money all the time. People raise money for businesses. This is a business that you're asking them to support. It's a creative endeavor, but it's a business. Think of it that way. It's a business, right?
Yeah.
And so there's no harm in asking people to do it. And and I personally asked people who I knew it wasn't going to be any sweat off their back. You know what I mean? I didn't ask people who I know are a single mother raising 3 kids on one person's talent. I asked people who are millionaires. I asked people who are making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. So I didn't really feel
actively finance film and TV.
Actually, and actively finance things. So it wasn't difficult for me. But once I got over that, it wasn't difficult for me. It was difficult for me to start. But once I realized, like, oh, this is just the process. And also, when you realize this is what everybody does, you'll get over it really quickly. No movie came together because somebody just was sitting outside and the money fell down. It came together because somebody went out and asked people to give them money. Ava DuVernay raised $27 million for Origin across 14 people. She made phone calls, NBA players, the rich white people, everybody. She was asking everybody, right? So the point is, she did that only because she picked up the phone and she was asking for way more money than I was asking for.
Yeah. And even Jordan Peele, did he like have to put together the financing for Get Out?
Oh, that came through Blumhouse. But yeah, that's how money, once you accept that this is how the business works, people ask for money every day of the week. This is literally how it happens.
Because they're investing in a project that will hopefully make a return.
100%. But also, a lot of the times they don't even expect it to. If you find the right people, they're just like, here's $1 million. I'd literally, whatever.
I'd love to find those people. That would be wonderful.
Seriously. Those people exist.
Rochée, very random. I was just looking at you and your outfit and your whole look, and I was just like, why don't you have tattoos? Get a arm tattoo,
I
dude.
do.
Oh, all right.
I'm right there.
You
Right
need,
there.
you need more of the tattoo action. It's too polite,
I'm
that
too clean.
tattoo.
I'm too polite.
It's
Okay.
too clean. Get some dirty tattoos, get some rings. You know what I mean? You look like you should be more of like you look like a bald Erica Badu just waiting to bloom. That's what you look like.
That's actually 100% accurate.
All right. Here's my last question for you. I appreciate this interview. This has been so illuminating. You always educate me about the business. Last question for you. To the Rochée who was afraid of being seen just a few short months, years ago, what would you say to that Rochée? Whatever it is, whatever it is that you've learned that you would say.
This is what I'll say. Like, get your ego out of there. Like, get it out of there. And to be honest, like, being seen is not a bad thing. And and I think that's what I would say. I would say, get your ego out of here. Being seen is not a bad thing. And this is the last thing I would say. I do believe that I'm a marginalized person. I'm an immigrant. I'm Black. I'm queer. I'm a woman. And people need to see me. People need to see you, Charlotte. People need to see us, folks who are marginalized, folks who are otherized. They need to see us. And once you get yourself out of your head and stop making it about you and your issues and your ego and realize that you existing and telling stories is in service to other people. And that through me existing and through me thriving, through me putting myself out there, other people can be inspired, can be healed, can be liberated. I remember before we met formally, I watched your web series and I watched your stand-up. And that was such a huge moment for me too, because I saw another West Indian who is a degular Black girl. You know what I mean? Out here.
I'm sure I am regular.
We're degular Black girls.
Very regular. Mm-hmm.
Out here doing our thing, right? Like, because when I was growing up, I thought you had to be Halle Berry to be
I thought so as well.
worthy of people seeing or paying attention to you. And
actually, sorry, that's not true. Whoopi Goldberg was a huge inspiration to me. She was dark skinned. She was not pretty or traditionally pretty.
Yes.
She was funny, and she was not funny in a self-deprecating or a way about being Black or dark. She was just funny. And I was like, Whoopi Goldberg literally blew my mind.
She's a hero. But I do think for me, when it came time for college, I didn't pick. I've done theater my entire life. I was acting my whole life. I did not do theater because I was like, I'm not Halle Berry. And in my mind, that's what it required. And I realized, like, Issa, like, all these people who put themselves out there have helped to heal and to expand so many women of color.
Absolutely.
by existing. And so
by existing,
it's there's no harm in that at all, in putting yourself out there if that's the purpose.
One last thing I will say is you talked about ego, and we've talked about ego on this show before, but I'm somebody who didn't really understand what the ego was before I did a little bit of my internal work. And the ego, from my understanding, is the mask that we put on to the world to shield us from the things that we're afraid of: judgment, shame, things like that. So when you talk about having to check your ego, you're talking about having to, like, put down this mask, about having to essentially open yourself up to judgment, to shame, to the things that we are afraid of. But not everybody knows that it's their ego in play. Was there a sign to you? Was there a tip off that was like, oh, or was there a moment where you were able to recognize that this is what's going on?
To be honest, it took a friend of mine. I go on this hike every Sunday with my friend, and she was like, this is your ego. She was like, you're putting yourself out there about you and not about your purpose and what you're meant to be doing here on earth. And I will say this, and it's not to get too spiritual, but
let's
the truth
go there.
is,
let's do it.
For me, stand-up is a spiritual thing. When I do it, I feel in touch with the universe. It is very natural to me. It is my calling. This is the thing that I've been running away from my entire life. Ever since I was a kid, people like teenager, college, 20s, 30s, people were like, you need to be doing stand up. And I was like, nope. But when I do it, I see my power. I'm clicking on all cylinders, right? And I think that that is my calling. That is my purpose. And I was hiding from that because my ego was saying to me, people may abuse you. People may be mean. People may judge you. People may not think you're funny. And so to protect my ego, I did not put myself out there. And that mask is, I think ego, when we're acting in service to our ego, we're protecting ourselves. Yes, whatever the story is that we're telling ourselves, we're trying to protect that story so that it's not in any way damaged. And I think that could be one of the most dangerous things you can do to yourself, because you're really just holding yourself back, for sure.
So, and here's a great example of it. Like, you not wanting to do stand up is you created your ego creates this story that says, I'm not a stand up because I'm not what they look like, or whatever fear, whatever you're trying to protect yourself from. And then, but even though your gut, your intuition, your being is saying you should probably be doing stand up, but this self that you've created is a self that don't do stand up. So now, in order for you to do it, you kind of have to get real with yourself. You got to get real with yourself and realize that you can do whatever you want. You can literally do whatever you want. There are no rules. There is nothing set in stone in terms of who you are. You can always choose.
And it's so funny you bring up Whoopi Goldberg, because I was just talking about Whoopi before, because Whoopi is somebody that I think this generation, and us even, we lost a little, because we came out at a little, after she was at her height. But what Whoopi did was remarkable. And the only reason why Whoopi was able to do it is because she believed in herself. But more importantly, she had a purpose that was beyond anything that we had seen before, or what we had established in our culture as what was acceptable or what was worthy of seeing on television or whatever. And she just went with it. And I think a lot of times you can get in your head and be like, well, I don't look like this, or I'm not like this person. It's like, we're beautiful too. We're cute too. Right. We're regular degular, but there's nothing wrong with being regular degular. That's most of us. 90% of people are regular degular.
Who's not regular?
And 90% of us are regular degular. Why do we think we have to be this like exceptional, ridiculous idea of what we're supposed to be in order to be seen? That's absurd.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, Rochée, thank you so much. You don't have to be special to be seen. What a great message. Appreciate you. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Of course. Thank you for having me. This has been great.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode with Rochée Jeffrey. If you want to learn more about the business of Hollywood, my course, Get Repped and Break into TV Writing, actually goes into the business of Hollywood for screenwriters, how to get repped and how to break into TV. If you're interested in that, there'll be a link right down below. Well, that's all I got for you for today. I hope you enjoyed that episode. Until next time, get out there, get to work.